When Mr. Hiram B. Otis, an American minister, bought Canterville Chase, everyone told him he was doing a very foolish thing, as there was no doubt at all that the place was haunted. Indeed, Lord Canterville himself, a man of the most punctilious honour, had felt it his duty to mention the fact to Mr. Otis when they came to discuss terms. "I feel bound to tell you," he said, "that the ghost has been seen by several living members of my family, and Lady Canterville often got very little sleep at night in consequence of mysterious noises." "My lord," answered the minister, "I will take the furniture and the ghost at a valuation. I come from a country where we have everything that money can buy. I reckon that if there were such a thing as a ghost in Europe, we'd have it in a very short time in one of our museums, or on the road as a show." "I fear the ghost exists," said Lord Canterville, smiling, "though it may have resisted the overtures of your enterprising impresarios. It has been well known for 3 centuries and always makes its appearance before the death of any member of our family." "Well, so does the family doctor, for that matter, Lord Canterville. But there is no such thing, sir, as a ghost. And I guess the laws of nature are not going to be suspended for the British aristocracy." A few weeks after this, the purchase was completed, and the minister and his family went down to Canterville Chase. Mrs. Otis, who, as Miss Lucretia R. Tappan, had been a celebrated New York belle, was now a very handsome, middle-aged woman. Their eldest son, christened Washington by his parents in a moment of patriotism, was a fair-haired, rather good-looking young man. Miss Virginia E. Otis was a girl of 15, lovely as a fawn. After her came the twins, delightful boys, and, with the exception of the worthy minister, the only true Republicans of the family. Mr. Otis had telegraphed for a wagonette to meet them at Ascot Station, and they started on their drive in high spirits. It was a lovely July evening, and the air was delicate with the scent of the pine woods. As they entered the avenue of Canterville Chase, however, a curious stillness seemed to hold the atmosphere. A great flight of rooks passed silently over their heads, and before they reached the house, some big drops of rain had fallen. Standing on the steps to receive them was an old woman, neatly dressed in black silk. This was Mrs. Umney, the housekeeper. She made them a low curtsy and said, "I bid you welcome to Canterville Chase." Following her, they passed through the fine Tudor hall into the library, at the end of which was a large stained-glass window. Here they found tea laid out. They sat down while Mrs. Umney waited on them. Suddenly Mrs. Otis caught sight of a red stain on the floor just by the fireplace and said to Mrs. Umney, "I am afraid something has been spilt there." "Yes, madam," replied the old housekeeper. "It is the blood of Lady Eleanor de Canterville, who was murdered on that very spot by her husband, Sir Simon, in 1575. Sir Simon survived her 9 years and disappeared suddenly under very mysterious circumstances. His body has never been discovered, but his guilty spirit still haunts the Chase. The bloodstain has been much admired and cannot be removed." "That is nonsense," cried Washington Otis. "Pinkerton's Champion Stain Remover and Paragon Detergent will clean it up in no time." And before the housekeeper could interfere, he was rapidly scouring the floor with a small stick of what looked like a black cosmetic. In a few moments, no trace of the bloodstain could be seen. "I knew Pinkertons would do it," he exclaimed triumphantly, but no sooner had he said these words than a fearful peal of thunder made them all start, and Mrs. Umney fainted. "My dear Hiram," cried Mrs. Otis, "what can we do with a woman who faints?" "Charge it to her like breakages," answered the minister. "She won't faint after that." And in a few moments Mrs. Umney certainly came to. There was no doubt, however, that she was extremely upset. She sternly warned Mr. Otis to beware of trouble coming to the house, and tottered off to her own room. The storm raged fiercely all night, but nothing of particular note occurred. The next morning, however, they found the terrible stain of blood once again on the floor. Washington rubbed out the stain a second time, but the second morning it appeared again, though the library had been locked. The whole family were now quite interested, and Mr. Otis began to suspect that he had been too dogmatic in his denial of the existence of ghosts. That night all doubts were removed forever. Mr. Otis was awakened by a noise in the corridor outside his room. It sounded like the clank of metal. Mr. Otis struck a match and looked at the time. It was exactly 1 o'clock. The strange noise continued, and with it he distinctly heard footsteps. He put on his slippers, took a small phial out of his dressing case, and opened the door. Right in front of him he saw, in the moonlight, an old man of terrible aspect. His eyes were as burning coals. Grey hair fell over his shoulders in matted coils. His garments of antique cut were soiled and ragged, and from his wrists and ankles hung heavy manacles. "My dear sir," said Mr. Otis, "I really must insist on your oiling those chains, and have brought you for that purpose a bottle of the Tammany Rising Sun Lubricator. It is said to be completely efficacious upon one application, and there are several testimonials to that effect upon the wrapper. I will be happy to supply you with more, should you require it." With these words, the United States minister laid the bottle down on a table, and closing his door, retired to rest. For a moment the Canterville Ghost stood quite motionless. Then, dashing the bottle violently upon the floor, he fled, uttering hollow groans and emitting a ghastly green light. Just, however, as he reached the top of the great oak staircase, a door was flung open. 2 little white-robed figures appeared, and a large pillow whizzed past his head. Hastily adopting the 4th dimension of space, the ghost vanished through the wainscoting. On reaching a small secret chamber in the west wing, he leaned up against a moonbeam to recover his breath. Never, in a brilliant career of 300 years, had he been so grossly insulted. With the egotism of the true artist, he went over his most celebrated performances. He thought of his last appearance as Red Reuben or the Strangled Babe, his debut as Gaunt Gibeon, the bloodsucker of Bexley Moor, and the furor he had excited one lovely June evening by merely playing ninepins with his own bones upon the lawn tennis ground. And after all this, some wretched modern Americans were to come and offer him the Rising Sun Lubricator and throw pillows at his head. No ghost in history had ever been treated in this manner. He remained till daylight in an attitude of deep thought. The next morning, the United States minister was a little annoyed to find that his present had not been accepted. "If the ghost declines to use the Rising Sun Lubricator," he said, "we shall have to take his chains from him. It would be quite impossible to sleep with such a noise going on." The second appearance of the ghost was on Sunday night. Shortly after they had gone to bed, they were suddenly alarmed by a fearful crash in the hall. Rushing downstairs, they found that a large suit of armor had fallen on the stone floor, while seated in a high-backed chair was the Canterville Ghost, rubbing his knees with an expression of agony on his face. The United States minister covered him with his revolver and called upon him, in accordance with Californian etiquette, to hold up his hands. The ghost started up with a shriek and swept through them like a mist, extinguishing Washington Otis's candle as he passed. On reaching the top of the staircase, he determined to give his celebrated peal of demonic laughter, but hardly had the fearful echo died away when a door opened, and Mrs. Otis came out in a dressing gown. "I am afraid you are far from well," she said, "and I've brought you a bottle of Dr. Dobell's tincture. If it is indigestion, you will find it a most excellent remedy." The ghost glared at her in fury and began at once to make preparations for turning himself into a large black dog, an accomplishment for which he was justly renowned. The sound of the approaching footsteps of the twins, however, made him hesitate. He contented himself with becoming faintly phosphorescent and vanished with a deep churchyard groan. On reaching his room, he entirely broke down. He had hoped that even modern Americans would be thrilled by the sight of a specter in armor. It was his own suit. He had worn it with great success at the Kenilworth tournament. Yet when he had put it on now, he had been completely overpowered by the weight, and had fallen heavily, barking both his knees severely. For some days after this, he hardly stirred out of his room, except to keep the bloodstain in proper repair. However, he resolved to make a third attempt to frighten the United States minister and his family. He selected Friday, the 17th of August, and spent most of that day in looking over his wardrobe, ultimately deciding in favor of a large hat with a red feather, a winding sheet, and a rusty dagger. His plan was this. He was to make his way to Washington Otis's room, gibber at him from the foot of the bed, and stab himself 3 times in the throat. He bore Washington a special grudge, being quite aware that it was he who was in the habit of removing the famous Canterville bloodstain. The ghost was then to proceed to the room occupied by the United States minister and his wife, there to place a clammy hand on Mrs. Otis's forehead, while he hissed into her trembling husband's ear the awful secrets of the charnel house. With regard to little Virginia, he had not quite made up his mind. She had never insulted him and was pretty and gentle. A few groans from the wardrobe he thought would be more than sufficient. As for the twins, he was determined to stand between them in the form of a green, icy cold corpse till they became paralyzed with fear, and then to crawl round the room with white bleached bones and one rolling eyeball in the character of Dumb Daniel or the Suicide Skeleton. As midnight sounded, the ghost stepped stealthily out of the wainscoting with an evil smile on his mouth, muttering strange 16th century curses, and brandishing the rusty dagger, he turned the corner of the passage that led to Washington's room. But no sooner had he done so than with a piteous wail of terror he fell back. Right in front of him was standing a horrible specter. Hideous laughter seemed to writhe its features. From the eyes streamed rays of scarlet light, and on its breast was a placard with strange writing in antique characters. After a second hasty glance, the ghost fled back to his room, tripping up in his long winding sheet as he sped down the corridor. Once in his own apartment, however, after a time, the brave old Canterville spirit asserted itself. He determined to go and speak to the other ghost as soon as it was daylight. Accordingly, he returned. On reaching the spot, however, a terrible sight met his gaze. Something had happened to the spectre. It was leaning up against the wall in a strained and uncomfortable attitude. He rushed forward and seized it, when, to his horror, the head slipped off and rolled on the floor. The body assumed a recumbent posture, and he found himself clasping a white bed curtain with a sweeping brush, and a hollow turnip lying at his feet. Unable to understand this curious transformation, he clutched the placard and read these fearful words: "Ye Otis ghost, ye duly true and original spook, beware of ye imitations. All others are counterfeit." The whole thing flashed across him. He had been tricked, foiled, and outwitted. For 5 days the ghost kept to his room, and at last made up his mind to give up the bloodstain on the library floor. The Otis family clearly did not deserve it. They were evidently people on a low, material plane, quite incapable of appreciating phenomena. The question of apparitions was, of course, quite a different matter. It was his duty to appear once a week, and to gibber from the large oriel window on the first and third Wednesday in every month, and he did not see how he could honorably escape from his obligations. For the next 3 Saturdays, accordingly, he traversed the corridor as usual between midnight and 3 o'clock, taking every possible precaution against being either heard or seen. He removed his boots and was careful to use the Rising Sun lubricator for oiling his chains. Still, he was not left unmolested. Strings were continually being stretched across the corridor, over which he tripped, and on one occasion, while dressed for the part of Black Isaac or the huntsman, treading on a butter slide which the twins had constructed. This last insult so enraged him that he resolved to visit the insolent young Etonians the next night in his celebrated character of Reckless Rupert or the Headless Earl. He had not appeared in this disguise for more than 70 years. The leather riding boots that went with the dress were just a little too large for him, and he could only find one of the 2 horse pistols. But on the whole he was quite satisfied, and at 1:15 he glided out of the wainscoting. On reaching the room occupied by the twins, he found the door just ajar. Wishing to make an effective entrance, he flung it wide open, when a heavy jug of water fell, wetting him to the skin. At the same moment he heard stifled shrieks of laughter from the bed. He fled back to his room, and the next day was laid up with a severe cold. The only thing that consoled him in the whole affair was the fact that he had not brought his head with him, for the consequences might have been very serious. He now gave up all hope of ever frightening this rude American family, and contented himself with creeping about in slippers, with a muffler round his throat for fear of draughts, and a small arquebus in case he should be attacked by the twins. It was generally assumed by the family that the ghost had gone away, and in fact Mr. Otis wrote a letter to that effect to Lord Canterville. However, the ghost was still in the house, and though now almost an invalid, was by no means ready to let matters rest, particularly as he heard that among their guests was the young Duke of Cheshire, whose granduncle, Lord Francis Stilton, had once bet 100 guineas that he would play dice with the Canterville Ghost, and was found the next morning lying on the floor of the card-room in such a helpless paralytic state that he was never able to say anything again but double sixes. The ghost was naturally anxious to show that he had not lost his influence over the Stiltons. At the last moment, however, his terror of the twins prevented his leaving his room, and the young Duke slept in peace in the royal bedchamber and dreamed of Virginia. A few days after this, Virginia was running past the tapestry chamber, the door of which happened to be open. She fancied she saw someone inside and looked in. To her immense surprise, it was the Canterville Ghost. So forlorn and so much out of repair did he look that Virginia, whose first idea had been to run away, was filled with pity. He was not aware of her presence till she spoke to him. "My brothers are going back to Eton tomorrow," she said, "and then if you behave yourself, no one will annoy you." "It is absurd asking me to behave myself," he answered, looking round in astonishment at the girl who'd ventured to address him. "I must rattle my chains and walk about at night. It's my only reason for existing." "It is no reason at all. And you know you have been very wicked. Mrs. Umney told us, the first day we arrived here, that you killed your wife." "Well, I quite admit it," said the ghost petulantly, "but it was purely a family matter. My wife was very plain, never had my ruffs properly starched, and knew nothing about cookery. And I don't think it was very nice of her brothers to starve me to death, though I did kill her. Oh, I'm so lonely and unhappy. I want to go to sleep. I've not slept for 300 years, and I'm so tired." Virginia came towards him and, kneeling down, looked up into his old, withered face. "Poor ghost," she murmured. "Have you no place where you can sleep?" "Far away," he answered. "There is a garden there. The grass grows deep there, the white stars of the hemlock flower. There the nightingale sings all night long, and the yew tree spreads out its giant arms over the sleeper." "You mean the Garden of Death?" Virginia whispered. "Yes. Death must be so beautiful. To lie in the brown earth, the grasses waving above one's head. To have no yesterday and no tomorrow. To forget time, to forgive life, to be at peace. You can help me. You can open for me the portals of death's house. For love is always with you, and love is stronger than death." Virginia trembled. Then the ghost spoke again. "Have you ever read the prophecy on the library window?" "Often," cried the girl. "I know it quite well. When a golden girl can win prayer from out the lips of sin, when the barren almond bears, and a little child gives away its tears, then shall all the house be still, and peace come to Canterville." "But I don't know what they mean." "They mean," he said sadly, "that you must weep with me for my sins because I have no tears, and pray with me for my soul because I have no faith, and then, if you have always been sweet and good and gentle, the angel of death will have mercy on me. You will see shapes in the darkness, and voices will whisper in your ear, but they will not harm you, for against the purity of a child the powers of hell cannot prevail." Virginia made no answer, and the ghost wrung his hands in wild despair. Suddenly she stood up. "I am not afraid," she said firmly, "and I will ask the angel to have mercy on you." He rose with a cry of joy, and taking her hand bent over it with old-fashioned grace and kissed it. His fingers were as cold as ice, and his lips burned like fire, but Virginia did not falter. On the faded green tapestry were embroidered little huntsmen. Their tiny hands waved to her. "Go back, Virginia," they cried. "Go back." But the ghost clutched her hand more tightly. Animals with lizard tails blinked at her from the carved chimney-piece and murmured, "Beware, Virginia, beware." But the ghost glided on, and Virginia did not listen. When they reached the end of the room, she opened her eyes and saw the wall slowly fading away like a mist, and in a moment the wainscoting closed behind them. As Virginia did not come down for tea, Mrs. Otis sent up one of the footmen to tell her. He returned and said that he could not find Miss Virginia anywhere. Mrs. Otis was not alarmed at first, but when 6 o'clock struck, she became agitated and sent the boys out to look for her, while she and Mr. Otis searched every room in the house. At 6:30, the boys came back and said that they could find no trace of their sister. Having sent off Washington and 2 of the farm servants to scour the district, Mr. Otis ordered his horse to be brought round and rode off to Ascot. At the railway station he inquired if anyone answering the description of Virginia had been seen, but could get no news of her. After riding all over a nearby common, he returned homewards tired and heartbroken. He found Washington and the twins waiting at the gatehouse. Not the slightest trace of Virginia had been discovered. In a state of deepest depression, Mr. Otis and the boys walked up to the house. In the hall they found poor Mrs. Otis almost out of her mind with anxiety. Mr. Otis ordered them all to bed, saying that nothing more could be done that night and that he would telegraph in the morning to Scotland Yard. Just then, midnight began to boom from the clock tower, and when the last stroke sounded, they heard a crash and a sudden shrill cry. A panel at the top of the staircase flew back with a loud noise, and out onto the landing with a casket in her hand stepped Virginia. In a moment they had all rushed up to her. "Good heavens, child, where have you been?" said Mr. Otis. "Your mother has been frightened to death." "Papa," said Virginia quietly, "I have been with the ghost. He is dead. He had been very wicked, but he really was sorry, and he gave me this box of beautiful jewels before he died." The whole family gazed at her in amazement. Turning round, she led them through the opening in the wainscoting, down a narrow, secret corridor. Finally, they came to a great oak door. When Virginia touched it, it swung back, and they found themselves in a room with one tiny grated window. Embedded in the wall was a huge iron ring, and chained to it was a skeleton. It seemed to be trying to grasp with its long, fleshless fingers an old-fashioned trencher and ewer placed just out of its reach. Suddenly one of the twins, who had been looking out of the window, exclaimed, "The old withered almond tree has blossomed. I can see the flowers quite plainly in the moonlight." 4 days after these curious incidents, a funeral started from Canterville Chase about 11 o'clock at night. The hearse was drawn by 8 black horses, and the coffin was covered by a rich purple pall on which was embroidered in gold the Canterville coat of arms. Lord Canterville was the chief mourner, having come up specially from Wales. A deep grave had been dug in the churchyard just under the old yew tree, and the service was read in the most impressive manner by the Reverend Augustus Dampier. As the coffin was being lowered into the grave, Virginia laid on it a cross made of white and pink almond blossoms. As she did so, from a distant copse, a nightingale began to sing. The next morning, before Lord Canterville went up to town, Mr. Otis had an interview with him on the subject of the jewels the ghost had given to Virginia. Their value was so great that Mr. Otis felt considerable scruples about allowing his daughter to accept them. Lord Canterville shook him cordially by the hand and said, "My dear sir, your charming daughter rendered my unlucky ancestor Sir Simon a very important service. The jewels are clearly hers. Besides, you forget, Mr. Otis, that you took the furniture and the ghost at valuation, and anything that belonged to the ghost passed at once into your possession." Lord Canterville finally induced the minister to allow his daughter to retain the jewels, and when in the spring of 1890 the young Duchess of Cheshire was presented on the occasion of her marriage, they were the universal theme of admiration. For Virginia received the coronet, which is the reward of all good little American girls, and was married to the young Duke as soon as he came of age. Everyone was delighted at the match, except, strange to say, Mr. Otis himself. Mr. Otis was extremely fond of the young Duke personally, but theoretically he objected to titles. His objections, however, were completely overruled, and I believe that when he walked up the aisle of St. George's, Hanover Square, with his daughter leaning on his arm, there was not a prouder man in the whole length and breadth of England.